The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet street where Margaret, Maggie, Harper lived. The neighborhood, once vibrant with the laughter of children and the chatter of families, now felt hollow, a shell of its former self. Maggie sat in her worn armchair by the window, gazing at the overgrown garden her late husband, George, had so lovingly tended. A sigh escaped her lips, her hand absently tracing the faint outlines of her wedding ring. Her house, a modest two-story home with peeling paint and sagging shutters, stood as a testament to decades of memories. It had witnessed the milestones of her life, her wedding, the birth of her 6 children, and countless family gatherings filled with warmth and laughter. But now, it felt like a stranger to her, its walls echoing with a silence she couldn't escape. A sharp knock on the door broke her reverie. Maggie's heart quickened as she shuffled toward the entrance. Visitors were rare these days, and a part of her clung to the faint hope that perhaps one of her children had come to see her. But when she opened the door, a stern-faced man in a gray suit stood before her, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Harper?" he asked, his tone professional but not unkind. "Yes," Maggie replied, gripping the doorframe for support. "I'm here to deliver this." The man handed her an envelope, his eyes avoiding hers. Maggie's hands trembled as she opened the letter. The words on the page blurred together, but a few phrases stood out like flashing warning signs: notice of eviction, delinquent payments, and 30 days to vacate. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "There must be some mistake." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the man said, his voice softening. "If you have questions, there's a number to call at the bottom of the letter." Maggie closed the door slowly, clutching the letter to her chest as if holding it any tighter might make it disappear. She returned to her armchair, sinking into its familiar embrace. The weight of the notice settled over her like a storm cloud, suffocating and inescapable. Her mind raced back to her children: Michael, the eldest; Clara, the ambitious career woman; Peter, her once rebellious middle child; and the youngest 3, who had always seemed to fade into the background. They had all grown up in this house. She had cooked their meals, patched up their scraped knees, and stayed up late waiting for them to come home from school dances and first dates. And now? Not one of them had set foot in the house in months, maybe years. Maggie reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over Michael's number. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks, and their last conversation had been curt and strained. She imagined his voice, brisk and impatient, brushing off her concerns with promises to talk later. Her hand fell to her lap. She couldn't bring herself to dial. Instead, she stared at the eviction notice again. The idea of losing her home, the place where she had poured so much of her life and love, felt unbearable. But the more she thought about it, the more another thought crept in, unbidden but persistent. Had her children abandoned her? The clock ticked loudly in the corner, marking the passage of time as Maggie wrestled with the enormity of her situation. Outside, the world carried on, oblivious to the quiet heartbreak unfolding within her walls. Tomorrow, she told herself, tomorrow, I'll figure out what to do. But as she sat alone in the gathering dusk, the ache in her chest reminded her of a truth she didn't want to face. Tomorrow might be too late. The morning sunlight spilled through the sheer curtains of Maggie's living room, but it brought little warmth. Maggie sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice lying flat before her like a silent accusation. Her tea had gone cold, untouched. She stared at the paper, her thoughts drifting to her children. Her 6 children, all grown, all scattered, and seemingly all absent from her life. Where had they gone? And why had they stayed away? She began to picture each of them, starting with Michael, her eldest. Michael had always been the responsible one, or so she had thought. When George passed away, Michael was 23, and Maggie leaned on him to help guide his younger siblings. He had taken on the role reluctantly, balancing the weight of his mother's expectations with his own dreams of becoming a lawyer. But somewhere along the way, Michael had distanced himself. Maggie hadn't seen him in nearly a year. Then there was Clara, her second-born. Clara had always been ambitious, even as a little girl. Maggie used to joke that Clara would grow up to rule the world. True to form, Clara had climbed the corporate ladder, landing an executive position in Chicago. But with every step up, she seemed to step further away from the family. Calls became sporadic, visits nearly non-existent. Peter, her middle child, was next in her mental inventory. Peter had been her wild one, the rebel. As a teenager, he had a knack for trouble, sneaking out late and clashing with his siblings. Maggie remembered the fiery argument between Peter and Michael just before Peter left home. He hadn't spoken to Michael since. The distance between Peter and the family had only grown, and now Maggie didn't even know where he lived. Her youngest three, Emily, Jonathan, and Samantha, were almost a blur in her memories, overshadowed by the chaos of raising 6 children while working 2 jobs. Emily was a nurse in Seattle, Jonathan was a software engineer in Austin, and Samantha, the baby of the family, had moved to Florida to pursue a career in event planning. Each of them seemed to have embraced their independence so fully that they had forgotten the woman who had given them the foundation to stand on. Maggie sighed and pressed her hands against her temples. It wasn't as though she hadn't tried to keep them close. She had called, sent birthday cards, even invited them all over for Thanksgiving last year. But one by one, they had offered excuses, work, travel, other plans. The table had been empty, save for Maggie and a store-bought turkey she didn't bother carving. She picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts. Each name stared back at her like a reminder of her failure to keep her family intact. Maggie settled on Clara and tapped the call button. The phone rang several times before a sharp, professional voice answered. "Hi, Mom. Can this wait? I'm about to head into a meeting." Maggie hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. I wanted to check in. It's been a while." "Yes, I know. It's been crazy here. I'll call you later, okay?" Before Maggie could respond, the line went dead. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down. She knew Clara's promise of a return call was empty. She'd heard it too many times before. Maggie felt an overwhelming urge to revisit the past, to remind herself of the time when her children had needed her, when they had loved her without reservation. She shuffled to the living room and opened a wooden chest tucked beneath the staircase. Inside were photo albums, each one bursting with memories. She flipped through the pages, her eyes misting as she traced the images with her fingertips. A young Michael holding baby Samantha, Peter grinning mischievously on his first day of school, Clara's proud smile at her high school graduation. These moments had been the glue that held her family together. But somewhere along the way, the glue had dried and cracked, leaving only fragments. A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly wiped her eyes. She shuffled to the entrance, hoping, for the briefest of moments, that it might be one of her children. But it was Lucy, her neighbor, holding a tin of cookies. "Morning, Maggie," Lucy said cheerfully, stepping inside uninvited. "I thought I'd drop by. Made too many cookies again, and I know you love chocolate chip." Maggie forced a smile and accepted the tin. "Thank you, Lucy. That's very kind of you." Lucy's eyes narrowed as she took in Maggie's somber expression. "Something's bothering you. What is it?" Maggie hesitated, then sighed. "It's nothing, really. Just thinking about my kids." Lucy pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for Maggie to do the same. "You don't have to carry it all alone, you know. Have you reached out to them?" "I've tried," Maggie said, her voice trembling, "but it's like they don't care anymore." Lucy placed a comforting hand on Maggie's. "Maybe they just need a reminder of what they're missing. You should write to them, tell them how you're feeling." Maggie nodded, though her heart felt heavy with doubt. Would a letter really make a difference? As the day wore on, Maggie found herself staring at a blank sheet of paper, pen in hand. She didn't know where to begin or whether her words would even reach the hearts of her children, but she resolved to try. For now, it was all she could do. The evening air hung heavy as Maggie sat at her kitchen table, staring at the blank page before her. The eviction notice loomed nearby, a stark reminder of the urgency pressing against her heart. With a deep breath, she picked up her pen, her hand trembling slightly, and began to write. "Dear Michael," she started, her pen hesitating as emotions welled up. How could she put into words the ache of her loneliness or the yearning she felt for her eldest son? Memories of him as a boy flooded her mind. Michael proudly presenting his school projects, standing protectively over his younger siblings, and smiling at her as though she were the most important person in his world. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I miss the days when we used to talk about everything, when you'd sit at the kitchen table and tell me about your plans for the future. I'm so proud of the man you've become, but I can't help feeling like I've lost you along the way. The words felt heavy, almost too vulnerable. Maggie paused, wondering if Michael would even read the letter. Would he dismiss it as yet another plea for attention? She shook her head, forcing herself to press on. I want you to know that I don't blame you for anything. I understand life gets busy, and you have your own family now. But I've been struggling, Michael. The house feels so empty these days, and I guess I just miss my children more than I know how to say. She signed her name with a shaky flourish and folded the letter, slipping it into an envelope. She repeated the process for each of her children, tailoring her words to their unique personalities and shared memories. To Clara, she wrote about the summer they spent baking together, laughing as flour dusted their faces. To Peter, she expressed her sorrow over their estrangement and her hope for reconciliation. To Emily, Jonathan, and Samantha, she poured out her pride in their accomplishments and her longing to see them again. By the time the letters were sealed, Maggie felt drained but oddly lighter, as if the act of writing had unburdened her soul. The following day, Maggie walked to the post office, clutching the letters tightly. The brisk autumn wind tugged at her coat, and the vibrant leaves crunched beneath her sensible shoes. She hadn't been out in days, and the fresh air was both invigorating and bittersweet. As she handed the letters to the postal clerk, she hesitated for a moment. What if they didn't respond? What if her words were met with silence? The thought stung, but she reminded herself that she had done all she could. Something important? The clerk asked kindly as she stamped the envelopes. Very, Maggie replied with a faint smile. That evening, Maggie sat by the window, watching the sun set behind the skeletal branches of the oak tree in her front yard. She held a framed photo of her late husband, George. His strong, kind eyes gazed back at her, a silent reminder of the life they had built together. "Oh, George," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "What would you do? You always knew how to bring them back together. I feel like I failed them somehow." She thought back to the years after George's sudden passing. Maggie had been left to raise 6 children on her own, juggling 2 jobs while trying to provide them with love and stability. It hadn't been easy, and there were days when she felt like she was barely holding on. But she had persevered, fueled by the belief that her sacrifices would keep her family strong and united. Yet here she was, alone in the very house where she had once filled every room with laughter and love. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the counter. She hurried over, her heart leaping with hope. But when she picked it up, the screen displayed an unfamiliar number. "Hello," she answered hesitantly. "Mrs. Harper?" a polite voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is she. This is Jack Davidson, the attorney handling your eviction case. I wanted to follow up on the notice you received." Maggie's shoulders slumped. It wasn't one of her children, but at least someone was reaching out. She listened as Jack explained her options, his tone professional but sympathetic. The situation was dire, and unless she could catch up on payments, she would have no choice but to leave the home. "I understand this is overwhelming," Jack said. "If there's anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to call." Maggie thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper. As she hung up, the sense of helplessness threatened to overwhelm her once more. That night, as Maggie lay in bed, she replayed the events of the day in her mind. She had taken a step, small as it was, by reaching out to her children, but the uncertainty of their response gnawed at her. She clutched the photo of George tightly to her chest, whispering a silent prayer. "Please, let them come back," she murmured into the darkness. "I don't know how much longer I can do this alone." The morning sun peeked through the curtains, but Maggie felt no urgency to rise. She lay in bed, her mind heavy with worry and doubt. Though sending the letters had given her a fleeting sense of purpose, the uncertainty of what lay ahead consumed her. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She glanced at the clock, barely past 8. "Maggie, are you in there?" Lucy's voice rang out from the porch. Maggie sighed, throwing on her robe as she shuffled to the door. Lucy stood there, her arms crossed over her chest and her expression a mix of concern and determination. "Morning, Lucy," Maggie said, trying to muster a smile. "Don't morning me," Lucy replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I saw the lawyer's car in your driveway yesterday. What's going on?" Maggie hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. She didn't want to burden Lucy with her troubles, but the weight of the situation made it impossible to hide. "I got an eviction notice," she admitted quietly. "I've fallen behind on the mortgage. I tried, but after George passed and with the kids—" Her voice trailed off, tears threatening to spill. Lucy's eyes softened, and she reached out to squeeze Maggie's hand. "Oh, Maggie, why didn't you tell me sooner? You've been dealing with this all by yourself?" "I didn't want to bother anyone," Maggie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And the kids. I don't think they even know how bad it's gotten." "Well, they ought to," Lucy said firmly. "This is their home too. At least, it used to be." Maggie nodded, her chest tightening. "I wrote them letters yesterday. I'm hoping they'll respond, but I don't know. They're so busy with their own lives." Lucy's expression turned thoughtful as she glanced around the room. The house, though clean and well-kept, bore the unmistakable signs of neglect. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the carpet frayed, and the furniture worn from years of use. "You're not in this alone, Maggie," Lucy said after a moment. "If the kids don't come through, we'll figure something out. The community won't let you lose this house without a fight." Maggie's eyes filled with gratitude, though a part of her doubted that anyone could help. "Thank you, Lucy. I don't know what I'd do without you." Later that day, Lucy returned with a small army of helpers, her teenage daughter, Rachel, and a few other neighbors. They arrived armed with cleaning supplies, tools, and an unshakable determination to help. Maggie protested at first, embarrassed by the attention, but Lucy waved her objections away. "Nonsense," Lucy said. "We're a community, and communities stick together." The group got to work, scrubbing, patching, and tidying every corner of the house. The yard, which had become overgrown and wild, was transformed as Rachel and another neighbor raked leaves and trimmed hedges. As Maggie watched from the porch, a warmth she hadn't felt in months began to creep into her heart. These weren't her children, but their kindness reminded her that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. By evening, the house looked better than it had in years. Maggie thanked each of her neighbors profusely, her voice cracking with emotion. "Now, don't you hesitate to ask if you need anything else," Lucy said as she gathered her things. "And don't worry about that eviction notice. We'll figure it out." Maggie smiled faintly, though the nagging fear of losing her home remained. That night, she sat by the window, watching the stars twinkle against the dark sky. She thought about her children and whether her letters had reached them yet. Would they care? Would they come? For now, all she could do was wait and hope. The next morning, Maggie sat by the mailbox, clutching her cup of tea as a crisp breeze nipped at her cheeks. She felt foolish waiting there. Letters didn't travel that fast, after all, but the idea of hearing from one of her children was the only thing giving her a glimmer of hope. The neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Maggie watched as the mail truck pulled up, the driver tossing envelopes into her mailbox before driving off without a glance. She shuffled to the box, her heart racing, only to find nothing of significance. A utility bill, a grocery store flyer, and an advertisement for home insurance. Disappointment settled over her like a heavy blanket. As she turned to go back inside, the phone rang. Maggie hurried to answer, her breath catching. "Hello," she said, her voice a mixture of hope and hesitation. "Mom." A deep, familiar voice came through the line. Maggie's knees buckled slightly, and she had to steady herself against the counter. "Michael?" "Yeah, it's me." There was a pause on the other end, as though he wasn't sure what to say next. "I got your letter." "Oh, Michael, I'm so glad to hear from you," Maggie said, her voice breaking. "How are you? How's Sarah and the kids?" "They're good, Mom. Busy, you know how it is." Michael's tone was neutral, careful. "Listen, about the letter. Are you really in trouble with the house?" Maggie hesitated. "Yes. I've been struggling for a while, but I didn't want to burden you." "Mom, Why didn't you call me sooner? Michael's voice had an edge of frustration. I didn't think you'd have time, she admitted. And I didn't want to make you feel obligated. Michael sighed heavily. Look, I'll see what I can do. Maybe we can help you out with some money for the payments. Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were from relief or the sting of realizing how distant her relationship with Michael had become. Thank you, Michael. That means the world to me. Don't thank me yet, he said, his voice softening. Let me figure out what's possible. I'll call you back soon. As the call ended, Maggie sat in silence, staring at the phone. It wasn't the heartfelt reunion she had imagined, but it was a start. The day passed slowly, and Maggie found herself pacing the house, her mind drifting to her other children. Would they respond as Michael had? Or would her letters go unanswered? Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie's phone buzzed again. This time, the screen displayed Clara's name. Clara? Maggie answered, her voice tentative. Hi, Mom, Clara said, her tone brisk but not unkind. I got your letter. I didn't realize things had gotten so bad. I didn't want to worry you, Maggie said, her chest tightening. You've got so much on your plate already. I do, but that doesn't mean I don't care, Clara replied, her voice softening. I'm sorry I haven't been in touch more. Work has been, well, you know how it is. Maggie's lips quirked into a small smile. Yes, I know. I'm just glad to hear from you now. Listen, I want to help, Clara continued. I'll talk to Michael, and maybe we can come up with a plan together. I'm not sure how much I can contribute, but we'll figure something out. Thank you, Clara, Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. That means so much to me. As the call ended, Maggie felt a flicker of hope. 2 of her children had responded, and both had offered to help. It wasn't the reunion she had dreamed of, but it was a step toward mending the fractures in her family. That night, Maggie sat in her favorite chair by the window, gazing at the stars. She thought about George, about the life they had built together, and about the love that had once bound their family so tightly. Perhaps, she thought, it wasn't too late to bring them back together. The next few days were a whirlwind. Maggie tried to hold on to the newfound hope that had come with hearing from Michael and Clara. She'd spoken to both of them more in the past few days than she had in months, and it made her wonder if perhaps they were slowly starting to see the cracks in the foundation of their family. Maybe it wasn't too late to rebuild. But as the days passed, Maggie's optimism began to falter. Michael had promised to get back to her, but there had been no follow-up. Clara's words were comforting, but her busy schedule made it difficult to believe that real help would materialize anytime soon. Each time the phone rang, Maggie's heart skipped a beat. Would it be one of her children calling, ready to offer the solution that would fix everything? Or would it be another reminder of how distant they had all become? Then, on the 5th day after receiving the calls from Michael and Clara, Maggie's phone rang again. This time, it was an unfamiliar number. Her heart raced as she picked up the phone. Hello? She said, her voice tentative. Mrs. Harper? The voice on the other end was polite but urgent. This is Jack Davidson again. I'm afraid I have some bad news. The bank is moving forward with the foreclosure process. You'll need to vacate the property by the end of the month. Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. Her grip tightened on the phone as she struggled to process the words. What do you mean, the end of the month? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I had more time. I'm sorry, but the paperwork has already been filed. The bank is set to take possession of the house if the arrears aren't cleared by the deadline. You'll need to make arrangements to vacate. Maggie's hand shook as she lowered the phone. The weight of the words pressed down on her chest, and the room suddenly felt too small. She had no more time. She could feel the tears pricking at her eyes, but she fought them back, unwilling to let herself break down. Not yet. Later that afternoon, Maggie found herself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the garden that had once been filled with her children's laughter. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Her thoughts turned to Michael and Clara. What had they really meant when they'd said they'd help? Were they just offering empty promises to ease their own guilt? But Maggie quickly pushed those thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to think that way, not now. She had to stay strong. The doorbell rang, and Maggie's pulse quickened. She wasn't expecting anyone, but perhaps it was one of her neighbors. Maybe someone had heard the news and had an idea of how they could help. She opened the door to find a familiar face standing on the porch. Lucy. "I'm sorry to just show up like this," Lucy said, her expression concerned. "But I thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Maggie swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Not so good, Lucy. I just heard back from the bank. They're going through with the foreclosure. I don't know what I'm going to do." Lucy's face softened, and she stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Maggie's shoulder. "I knew it was getting serious, but I didn't realize it was this bad. You're not alone in this, Maggie. We'll figure something out. I'll reach out to the others in the neighborhood, see if we can't come up with a plan to keep you here." Maggie felt her throat tighten as she held back tears. "Thank you, Lucy. I don't know what I'd do without you." As the days continued to pass, Maggie's thoughts never strayed far from the looming deadline. Every conversation with Michael and Clara was filled with promises, but the reality of the situation was that no one had come forward with anything tangible. Maggie began to wonder if perhaps this was a lesson she was meant to learn, that she couldn't rely on anyone but herself. Perhaps it was time to accept that the house, the only home she had ever known, was slipping through her fingers. One evening, as the last of the light faded from the sky, Maggie sat in her favorite chair, a cup of tea in her hands. The house was eerily quiet, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She thought of her children again, how they had once been so close, so full of love and life. It broke her heart to think that they couldn't find the time to truly help her when she needed them most. But just as despair began to settle in, Maggie's phone rang again. Her heart leaped in her chest. This time, it was Clara. "Mom," Clara said, her voice hesitant, "I've been talking to Michael and we've come up with a plan. It's not perfect, but we're going to send you some money to help with the mortgage." Maggie blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Wait, what? You and Michael?" "Yes," Clara continued. "It's not going to cover everything, but it should give you a little breathing room. We'll send what we can by the end of the week." Maggie's hands trembled as she pressed the phone closer to her ear. "Clara, you don't know how much this means to me." "I know, Mom," Clara replied softly. "I'm sorry it took us so long to come around, but we're going to make this right. I promise." As the conversation ended, Maggie sat back in her chair, the warmth of Clara's words slowly sinking in. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was perfect anymore. But this was enough to give her hope. And for the first time in a long while, Maggie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. The next few days were filled with a quiet anticipation. Maggie went about her usual routine, but her mind was never far from the promise Clara had made. It wasn't much, but it was something, a lifeline that allowed her to breathe just a little easier. Lucy, ever the supportive friend, continued to check in on her. Maggie was touched by how much effort the neighbors were putting into helping her. They'd kept the lawn tidy, and a few of them had even pitched in to buy groceries. Though the gesture was small, it felt like the kindness of a community rallying behind her, and that gave Maggie a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. That afternoon, she sat by the window with a cup of tea, her eyes tracing the clouds drifting lazily across the sky. The house felt different now, as if the air had shifted, carrying with it the faintest hint of hope. And then, just as she was about to set her cup down, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught her attention. Maggie's heart skipped a beat as she looked out the window. A car she didn't recognize was parked outside, dark, sleek, and polished. Her breath caught in her throat as the door opened, and a tall figure stepped out. Maggie's heart nearly stopped when she saw the person's face. It was Michael. She rushed to the door, her hands trembling as she turned the knob. Michael was standing on the porch, looking uncertain, as if he didn't know what to expect. "Michael," Maggie said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked up at her, his expression softening. "Hi, Mom. I came as soon as I could. I'm sorry it took so long. I wasn't sure how to approach this." Maggie stood there for a moment, frozen. After everything, after the silence, the waiting, it was hard to believe that he was actually standing here. "I didn't expect you to come," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," Michael replied. "I've been distracted. But I've been thinking a lot about what you said in your letter. You're my mom, and I should have been here for you, no matter what. I'm sorry. Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes, and she couldn't hold them back any longer. She stepped forward and hugged him tightly. I'm just so glad to see you, she whispered, her voice breaking. Michael held her for a long time, as if he, too, needed the reassurance that things could still be repaired. After a moment, he pulled back slightly, looking down at her. I spoke with Clara, he said, his voice a little steadier, and we've come up with a plan. We can help with the mortgage for a while. It won't solve everything, but we'll make sure you don't lose the house. Maggie pulled back to look at him, her chest swelling with relief. Michael, that's more than I ever expected. He gave her a small smile, though his eyes remained tinged with regret. I should have done this sooner. I've been so wrapped up in my own life, I didn't realize how much you needed us. I'm sorry, Mom. Maggie reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that had deepened since she'd last seen him. You don't have to apologize, sweetheart. It's just good to have you back. I never wanted you to feel obligated, but I needed to know you still cared. We do care, Mom, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, and I'm going to do better. Both of us are. Maggie felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She had spent so long feeling abandoned, so long wondering if her children would ever care again. But this moment, this promise, was more than enough. That night, Maggie sat in her chair by the window once more, her cup of tea now forgotten. The sky had turned a deep shade of purple, and the first stars had begun to twinkle. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt a sense of peace. Her children were coming back to her, not just in words, but in action. They had promised to help, and though the future was still uncertain, for the first time in a long time, Maggie believed that everything would be okay. As the evening stretched on, Maggie allowed herself to smile, her heart light with the knowledge that the family she had feared was lost was slowly finding its way back to her. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. The days following Michael's visit were filled with a mixture of cautious optimism and lingering uncertainty. Maggie didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but for the first time in months, she felt the weight of her situation lift ever so slightly. The promise from her children gave her a sense of hope, but deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about money or a house. It was about rebuilding the emotional bridges that had been broken for years. Michael and Clara's commitment to help her was a relief, but Maggie wasn't naive. She knew this would be a slow process. They would need to make up for lost time, to rebuild trust, and that wasn't something that could happen overnight. Still, Maggie was grateful for their efforts. She couldn't ignore the small victories that were starting to stack up. Her children were reaching out, showing up, and offering help in ways they hadn't in the past. The following weekend, Clara arrived at Maggie's house with her 2 young children in tow. They were a whirlwind of energy, racing through the house with the enthusiasm that only children could bring. Clara smiled apologetically as she followed them inside. I'm sorry, she said, shaking her head. They're a handful, but they wanted to see Grandma. Maggie chuckled softly, her heart warming as her grandchildren's laughter filled the air. She had missed this, the sound of family. You're always welcome here, Maggie said, kneeling down to greet the kids. I've missed you both so much. Clara watched her mother interact with the children, a thoughtful expression on her face. She had always known that Maggie loved her grandchildren, but seeing the bond between them reignited a sense of longing in her. Clara had been so focused on her own busy life that she hadn't realized how much of a presence her mother had been in their lives before. Mom, Clara said softly after a moment, I've been thinking. I know things haven't been great between us, but I want to do better. I want to help more, not just with money, but with being here with you. Maggie looked up at Clara, her heart swelling with emotion. You don't have to say that, Clara. Just having you here means the world to me. Clara reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. I'm sorry I wasn't there more for you. I know I've let you down, but I'm going to change that. I'll make time for you. Maggie smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've always been proud of you, Clara. You don't have to do anything to earn my love. I just want to know you're okay. That afternoon, Maggie and Clara sat in the living room, sipping tea as the children played in the next room. The house was alive with warmth again, and Maggie couldn't help but feel the stirrings of hope in her chest. Clara had always been the more distant of her children, but today something had shifted. Perhaps it was the passing of time, or perhaps it was seeing her mother in such a vulnerable state, but Clara seemed to be taking a more active role in her life and in their family's healing. For the first time, Maggie allowed herself to lean into that hope, trusting that perhaps this was the beginning of a new chapter. As the evening wore on, Michael called to check in, and Clara filled him in on their visit. Michael seemed quieter than usual, but Maggie could sense the same longing in his voice that Clara had expressed earlier. "Maggie," Michael said, his voice hesitant, "I've been thinking. I know we're still working out the details of the mortgage, but I want to do more. I want to help fix things between us, to fix everything. I've been a terrible son." Maggie was taken aback. She hadn't expected such a vulnerable confession, especially not from Michael, who had always been more reserved in matters of emotion. "You're not terrible, Michael," Maggie replied gently. "We've all made mistakes. I just want you to know that I love you, no matter what. But it's going to take time. We'll figure it out together." "I know," Michael said quietly, "and I'm willing to take the time. I promise you, Mom, we're going to make it right." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Michael and Clara continued to check in with Maggie, making arrangements to send money to help with the house payments. While Maggie wasn't entirely out of the woods yet, she could feel the shift in the air. The relationships with her children were beginning to heal, slowly but surely. Lucy, too, continued to support Maggie in ways that went beyond the practical. She called to check in, offered words of encouragement, and even invited Maggie over for dinner a few times. Maggie's heart was full of gratitude for the friends who had stepped up when her own children had distanced themselves. But it wasn't just about what others were doing for her. Maggie realized that something had changed within herself as well. In the face of adversity, she had found a well of strength she hadn't known existed. For so long, she had felt like a victim of circumstance, but now, she was seeing her situation differently. She was not helpless. She had fought for her family, and she had fought for her home. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. That night, as she sat by the window once again, watching the stars, Maggie realized that the glimmer of hope she had been holding onto was no longer just a flicker in the distance. It was beginning to burn brighter, fueled by the love of her children, the support of her friends, and the strength within herself. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The weeks that followed Michael and Clara's return were marked by subtle but significant changes. Maggie had always been a woman of faith, but over the past few years, the hardships and loneliness had shaken her belief in the world around her. Now, with her children slowly reconnecting and the community continuing to support her, she was forced to ask herself if it was possible to trust again, not just in her family, but in the goodness of people. Could she rebuild the life she had once taken for granted? Despite the cautious optimism she felt, there were moments when doubt crept in. Her heart still ached for the years lost, the birthdays missed, the holidays spent in silence. Every time Michael or Clara reached out, Maggie couldn't help but wonder if it was only temporary, if this newfound connection would fade as quickly as it had appeared. One crisp morning, Maggie received a letter that changed everything. It was from the bank. She had been anxiously awaiting it for days, but when it finally arrived, the weight of the envelope in her hands felt heavier than she expected. As she opened it, her eyes scanned the lines of text, heart pounding. The bank had granted her a reprieve on the mortgage. A temporary extension, they called it, but the terms were enough to give her some breathing room. She could pay a reduced amount for the next 6 months, and in the meantime, she had to work with them to devise a permanent solution. Maggie read the letter over and over again, disbelief settling in. It wasn't a permanent fix, but it was a lifeline, a reprieve that would allow her to keep the house, her home, the same house that had sheltered her and her family for so many years. She could hardly believe it. That evening, she called Clara first. She had been the most involved since Michael's visit, and Maggie felt she needed to share the news with her. "Clara, I don't know how to explain this, but I think we've been given a chance," Maggie said, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "The bank, well, They've extended the mortgage for 6 months. It's not a permanent fix, but it gives us time to come up with a plan. We won't lose the house for now." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, with a soft sigh, she responded, "That's incredible news, Mom. I'm so relieved. You deserve this, after everything you've been through. And we're going to make sure we do everything we can to keep you in your home." Maggie smiled, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Clara." Clara paused before responding, her voice full of emotion. "Mom, you don't have to thank me. You've always been there for us. Now it's our turn to be there for you." Later that week, Michael stopped by for a visit. It was his first time coming over since his promise to help, and Maggie was eager to share the good news. They sat in the living room, their conversation light but full of hope. "I spoke with the bank today," Maggie began, her hands shaking slightly. "They've given us an extension on the mortgage. It's not a forever solution, but it's a start." Michael's face softened with relief. "I'm glad, Mom. I know it doesn't solve everything, but it's a huge step in the right direction. We'll get through this, I promise." Maggie looked at her son, her heart swelling. For the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. But just as quickly, a thought crossed her mind. The 6-month extension was just that, an extension. What would happen after that? Would they be able to come up with a permanent solution? Would the bank be willing to help again? "Michael, I'm glad for the time, but I can't help but wonder what happens after this extension ends," Maggie said, her voice shaky. "What if we're still not able to pay by then?" Michael looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "We'll figure it out, Mom. If it comes down to it, we'll help you get back on track. Don't worry about that now. We've got 6 months to come up with a plan, and we're not doing this alone." The words were simple, but Maggie felt the depth of his commitment. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about rebuilding their bond, about taking responsibility for the family she had worked so hard to hold together. As the weeks passed, the reality of the situation began to set in. Maggie knew that the next 6 months would be a test of faith, both in her family and in herself. It wasn't just about keeping the house. It was about trusting that things could be different this time. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept everything together, but now she was learning to lean on her children. There were difficult moments, of course. There were misunderstandings and hard conversations. Clara and Michael didn't always agree on the best course of action, and Maggie still found herself grappling with feelings of insecurity and fear. But with each day that passed, she realized that the only way forward was together. And so, Maggie chose to have faith. Faith in her children, faith in the future, and, most importantly, faith in herself. One quiet evening, as Maggie sat alone on the porch watching the sunset, she reflected on everything that had happened. She had come so close to losing it all, but somehow, she hadn't given up. Through the support of her family and the strength she had discovered within herself, Maggie was starting to believe that even in the darkest times, there was always light to be found. In her heart, she knew that no matter what happened, she was not alone. The early days of spring brought with them a renewed sense of hope. The chill of winter had receded, and the promise of warmer days seemed to mirror the changes happening in Maggie's life. With her children now more involved and the weight of the mortgage lifted, even if temporarily, Maggie began to feel a spark of optimism. Yet, the uncertainty still loomed, and she knew that the road ahead would not be without its challenges. The 6-month extension from the bank was a temporary relief, and though it had given her a glimmer of hope, Maggie couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that time was running out. She had to act quickly, figure out a long-term solution, and for the first time in years, she realized that the future was in her hands. Clara visited her again that weekend, bringing the children along. The house was alive with the sounds of laughter as the kids played outside in the yard. It felt like a family again. A real family, not just a group of people connected by blood but separated by years of emotional distance. "Mom, I've been thinking," Clara said, as they sat together in the kitchen, drinking coffee. "I know we've talked about helping with the mortgage, but I also want us to start looking at other options. You deserve to live comfortably, not just scrape by. What if we explored some other financial solutions, like refinancing the house, or even considering selling and moving somewhere smaller?" We could still keep you near us, of course. Maggie listened carefully, her heart swelling with gratitude for Clara's proactive approach. She hadn't been expecting such a thoughtful suggestion, but it was the kind of conversation that felt like a step forward. That sounds practical, Maggie replied. I'll admit, the idea of moving is scary. I've been in this house for so long, and it's hard to think about letting it go. But if it's what's best, I'm willing to listen. Clara reached over and took her mother's hand. We'll do whatever it takes, Mom. I know it's hard, but we'll figure this out together. And you don't have to worry about being alone in this anymore. Maggie felt the warmth of her daughter's words settle deep inside her heart. It was clear that Clara wasn't just offering solutions. She was offering a commitment to Maggie's well-being, a promise that their family would stay together no matter what. The following week, Michael joined them for a family meeting, bringing with him a notebook full of ideas and potential options for their next steps. He had done some research into refinancing options, and though the process seemed complicated, he was determined to make it work for his mother. I think the best course of action is to keep this house, if possible, Michael said as he opened the notebook. Refinancing could give us a better rate and a more manageable monthly payment. I know it might seem like a hassle, but it might be worth the effort if it helps keep you in your home. Maggie listened, her mind swirling with the details. Her children had become more than just caregivers. They were her partners in this fight to preserve the life she had built. It wasn't easy, and there were still plenty of hurdles to overcome, but for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt like she was part of the solution, not just the problem. I'm willing to try, Maggie said finally, her voice steady. I'm not ready to let go of this place just yet. I've lived here all my life, and it means too much to me. I know it's not perfect, but it's still my home. Michael smiled and nodded. We'll do it together. We'll get the paperwork started tomorrow and see what options we have. As the days turned into weeks, Maggie and her children worked tirelessly to get everything in place for refinancing. It was a slow process, full of paperwork, meetings with the bank, and long conversations about what they could afford and what was realistic. But as challenging as it was, Maggie couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. She was no longer alone in this struggle. Clara and Michael took turns helping her fill out forms and dealing with the bank, always keeping her updated on progress. Lucy also pitched in, offering advice on budgeting and organizing her finances. Maggie's friends were more than just a shoulder to lean on. They were actively involved in helping her rebuild her life. There were moments when Maggie felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. There were still so many unknowns, and at times it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. But as she watched Clara and Michael working together, talking about the future, her faith in her family grew. They were a team now, working toward a common goal. One evening, as Maggie sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, she thought about how far she had come. Only a few months ago, she had been on the brink of losing everything. But now, surrounded by the love of her children, with the promise of a solution on the horizon, Maggie could finally begin to envision a future beyond the struggle. It wasn't just about keeping the house anymore. It was about reclaiming her life. It was about rediscovering the strength and resilience she had long forgotten. And with her children by her side, she knew she was capable of facing whatever came next. The 6-month extension from the bank was a temporary relief, and though it had given her a glimmer of hope, Maggie couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that time was running out. She had to act quickly, figure out a long-term solution, and for the first time in years, she realized that the future was in her hands. Clara visited her again that weekend, bringing the children along. The house was alive with the sounds of laughter as the kids played outside in the yard. It felt like a family again. A real family, not just a group of people connected by blood but separated by years of emotional distance. "Mom, I've been thinking," Clara said, as they sat together in the kitchen, drinking coffee. "I know we've talked about helping with the mortgage, but I also want us to start looking at other options. You deserve to live comfortably, not just scrape by. What if we explored some other financial solutions, like refinancing the house, or even considering selling and moving somewhere smaller? We could still keep you near us, of course." Maggie listened carefully, her heart swelling with gratitude for Clara's proactive approach. She hadn't been expecting such a thoughtful suggestion, but it was the kind of conversation that felt like a step forward. "That sounds practical," Maggie replied. "I'll admit, the idea of moving is scary. I've been in this house for so long, and it's hard to think about letting it go. But if it's what's best, I'm willing to listen." Clara reached over and took her mother's hand. "We'll do whatever it takes, Mom. I know it's hard, but we'll figure this out together. And you don't have to worry about being alone in this anymore." Maggie felt the warmth of her daughter's words settle deep inside her heart. It was clear that Clara wasn't just offering solutions. She was offering a commitment to Maggie's well-being, a promise that their family would stay together no matter what. The following week, Michael joined them for a family meeting, bringing with him a notebook full of ideas and potential options for their next steps. He had done some research into refinancing options, and though the process seemed complicated, he was determined to make it work for his mother. "I think the best course of action is to keep this house, if possible," Michael said as he opened the notebook. "Refinancing could give us a better rate and a more manageable monthly payment. I know it might seem like a hassle, but it might be worth the effort if it helps keep you in your home." Maggie listened, her mind swirling with the details. Her children had become more than just caregivers. They were her partners in this fight to preserve the life she had built. It wasn't easy, and there were still plenty of hurdles to overcome, but for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt like she was part of the solution, not just the problem. "I'm willing to try," Maggie said finally, her voice steady. "I'm not ready to let go of this place just yet. I've lived here all my life, and it means too much to me. I know it's not perfect, but it's still my home." Michael smiled and nodded. "We'll do it together. We'll get the paperwork started tomorrow and see what options we have." As the days turned into weeks, Maggie and her children worked tirelessly to get everything in place for refinancing. It was a slow process, full of paperwork, meetings with the bank, and long conversations about what they could afford and what was realistic. But as challenging as it was, Maggie couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. She was no longer alone in this struggle. Clara and Michael took turns helping her fill out forms and dealing with the bank, always keeping her updated on progress. Lucy also pitched in, offering advice on budgeting and organizing her finances. Maggie's friends were more than just a shoulder to lean on. They were actively involved in helping her rebuild her life. There were moments when Maggie felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of it all. There were still so many unknowns, and at times it felt like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. But as she watched Clara and Michael working together, talking about the future, her faith in her family grew. They were a team now, working toward a common goal. One evening, as Maggie sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood, she thought about how far she had come. Only a few months ago, she had been on the brink of losing everything. But now, surrounded by the love of her children, with the promise of a solution on the horizon, Maggie could finally begin to envision a future beyond the struggle. It wasn't just about keeping the house anymore. It was about reclaiming her life. It was about rediscovering the strength and resilience she had long forgotten. And with her children by her side, she knew she was capable of facing whatever came next. The process wasn't quick, and there were still many obstacles ahead. But Maggie felt a quiet optimism for the first time in years. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be worth it. She was not the same woman she had been when she started this journey. The hardships had transformed her, made her stronger, more capable of accepting help and offering it in return. As she thought about what lay ahead, Maggie knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. The weeks that followed felt like a marathon. Maggie had never imagined that the path to stability would be so fraught with paperwork, meetings, and financial calculations. But she kept her head up, buoyed by the support of her children, and began to understand something fundamental about herself. It wasn't just the house that needed saving. It was her whole life. Every day, as she walked through her home, Maggie found new meaning in the familiar sights. The worn-down kitchen table, where so many family meals had been shared, now felt like a symbol of resilience. The photos on the walls, memories of birthdays, anniversaries, and simple moments, no longer weighed her down. Instead, they reminded her of the family she had once feared she'd lost. One Saturday afternoon, as the leaves were beginning to change color, The bank finally approved the refinancing option. Maggie received a call from Michael, who was practically beaming as he shared the news. "Mom, we did it. The refinancing went through. We're officially on track to stabilize the house payments. It's not forever, but it's going to keep us in this home for the foreseeable future." Maggie could hardly believe the words. After months of uncertainty, it felt like a dream coming true. Her heart swelled with gratitude. "That's incredible," Maggie replied, her voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't think this day would come. I feel like I can finally breathe again. Good things come to those who don't give up, Mom. We never gave up on you. And now, we're back on our feet." As the relief settled in, Maggie began to reflect on the deeper changes in her life. It wasn't just the house that had been saved. It was her relationship with her children, with her community, and most importantly, with herself. The fear and loneliness that had defined so much of the last few years began to fade, replaced by a sense of self-worth and connection. But even as things improved, Maggie couldn't shake a lingering question. Could she truly move forward, or was she destined to always be held back by the scars of abandonment? The feelings of betrayal that had come with being left alone, the long years without contact from her children, still stung in her heart. She had forgiven Michael and Clara. She had to, for the sake of healing. But was there still an emotional chain holding her back from fully embracing the future? One evening, as the house quieted down after dinner, Maggie sat down with Michael. He had been spending more time at the house, working alongside Clara to finalize the refinancing details. Maggie knew this conversation was long overdue. "Michael, I've been thinking a lot," she began, looking at him with a tenderness she hadn't felt in years. "I've been so caught up in the logistics, the financials, that I haven't really let myself think about everything we've been through." Michael's expression softened, and he sat beside her. "Mom, I know we hurt you. And I know that words alone can't make up for the years we've lost. But we're here now, and we're going to make things right." Maggie felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm not angry anymore, Michael. I used to be. I think I was angry for so long because I didn't know how to feel, how to forgive. I just wanted to be left alone to hurt in peace. But I realize now that it's not about forgetting the past. It's about moving forward together." Michael took her hand in his voice filled with emotion. "We're not going anywhere, Mom. We've got you. I don't want to just rebuild the house. I want to rebuild our relationship." For a long time, Maggie didn't speak. The weight of his words settled deep in her heart. Finally, she whispered, "Then let's do it. Let's move forward together." The days that followed were a testament to the strength of family and the power of healing. Maggie no longer carried the burden of isolation. She began to reach out more to her friends, join church activities, and even started volunteering at the local community center. As the months passed, she felt the isolation she had lived with for so long dissipate, replaced by the connection she had yearned for. Her home became a hub of warmth and love once more. Clara and Michael visited regularly, bringing the kids along, and the laughter of grandchildren once again filled the house. What had once felt like a dark, empty space was now a sanctuary, a place where Maggie could share memories, make new ones, and rebuild the family ties that had been broken. One evening, as Maggie watched her children play with her grandchildren in the yard, she realized just how far she had come. The road ahead would never be perfect. There would still be bumps along the way, financial struggles, emotional scars, and challenges she couldn't predict. But for the first time in years, Maggie felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had not only broken the chains of abandonment, but also the ones she had placed around her heart. Her faith in her family was restored, and she had found the courage to rebuild not just her home but her life. That night, as Maggie lay in bed, she thought about all the years she had spent living in the shadows of grief and disappointment. But now, the shadows had lifted, and the future was hers to shape. Maggie wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The first signs of a new chapter began to appear slowly but surely. Maggie's life had been forever changed, not just by the upheavals of the past year, but by the quiet, steady work of rebuilding her family. Though the scars of abandonment would always remain, she had learned to wear them like a badge of resilience rather than a symbol of defeat. And now, as the new year began, Maggie felt like the possibilities before her were endless. It was a brisk morning in early January when Clara arrived at Maggie's house, her arms full of bags filled with groceries and a hopeful gleam in her eyes. "Mom," Clara said, breathless as she set the bags on the counter. "I've been thinking. What do you think about taking a little trip? Just you and me?" Maggie looked at her daughter in surprise. "A trip? Where to?" Clara smiled. "I know we've been focused on all the practical stuff lately, but I think we could use a change of scenery. Maybe head up to the lake for a few days. Just the two of us, like old times. I thought it would be a good way for us to reconnect, relax, and get away from everything for a bit." Maggie felt a rush of emotion. The idea of spending time with Clara alone, without the stress of everyday life and all the worries of the past, seemed like a breath of fresh air. For so long, their relationship had been strained, and the thought of re-establishing the kind of bond they once had made her heart swell. "Okay," Maggie said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I'd like that very much." The drive to the lake was filled with easy conversation, the kind of conversation that comes naturally between mother and daughter when the heavy weight of old wounds no longer dominates the air. They talked about everything: Clara's new job, Maggie's blossoming friendships, the kids, and even reflected on the rocky road they had traveled to get here. It felt like they were shedding the last remnants of the years lost to silence and misunderstanding. When they arrived at the small lakeside cabin, Maggie marveled at the peacefulness of the setting. The water shimmered under the clear blue sky, and the air was crisp with the promise of fresh starts. They spent the next few days walking along the shore, reminiscing about the past and talking about dreams for the future. It was more than just a vacation. It was a chance to rediscover each other. One evening, as the sun began to set over the water, Clara turned to her mother with a look of quiet reflection. "Mom," Clara said, "I want to say something. Something I've been thinking about for a long time." Maggie looked at her, her heart in her throat. "What is it, sweetheart?" Clara paused, gathering her words before speaking. "I know I can never make up for the years we lost. I can't change the fact that I left when you needed me the most. And I know that I hurt you in ways I'll never fully understand. But I want you to know this. I'm here now, and I'm never going to leave again." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, the weight of Clara's words washing over her. She had never heard her daughter speak so openly, so vulnerably. The apology she had longed for had come, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet sincerity of Clara's voice. "I forgive you, Clara," Maggie whispered. "I've forgiven you for a long time. I just needed to hear you say that you're here with me now. That's all I ever needed." They sat together in silence, the fading light casting long shadows over the still water. For the first time in years, Maggie felt truly at peace. The past was a part of them, but it no longer defined their future. They were starting anew. When they returned home, something had shifted. Maggie was no longer consumed by the weight of what had been. Her heart was open to the future, filled with gratitude and a renewed sense of possibility. She threw herself into the rhythm of daily life with vigor, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She was living, not just surviving. One afternoon, as Maggie was tending to her garden, Michael stopped by with some exciting news. "Mom, I think it's time to start planning for the future," he said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We've got the refinancing sorted, and now it's time to think about what's next. I want us to start looking into some home improvements, things to make this place more comfortable for you. It's yours, Mom, and I want it to feel that way." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. It was moments like this that reminded her of how far they had come. Her children were no longer just offering solutions. They were offering a future they were all building together. As the months passed, the changes in Maggie's life were undeniable. She continued to work on her home, both physically and emotionally, with a new sense of purpose. She focused on her health, started exercising more, and even joined a local book club where she made new friends. Slowly but surely, the loneliness that had once consumed her faded, replaced by a renewed sense of belonging. Her relationships with her children grew stronger every day. They celebrated birthdays together, had impromptu family dinners, and spent weekends enjoying each other's company. The house that once felt like a prison now felt like a home, a sanctuary of love and connection. But most importantly, Maggie had found her voice again. She no longer felt like a victim of circumstance, a woman forgotten and left behind. She was a woman with agency, a woman who had weathered storms and emerged stronger on the other side. One evening, as Maggie sat by the fire with Clara, watching the flames flicker in the hearth, she realized that life had given her a second chance. A chance to not only rebuild her family but also rediscover herself. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Maggie was ready to embrace whatever it held. Maggie sat in the warm glow of her kitchen, the soft hum of the radio in the background as she prepared dinner. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of quiet night that had once felt like a symbol of her isolation. But now, the house was full of life. Clara and Michael were both over, and the laughter of her grandchildren echoed from the living room. It had taken time, but her home had become a place of joy again. The fractures that once divided her family had been slowly mended, not by grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but through the quiet, persistent work of reconnecting, rebuilding, and forgiving. Maggie had learned that love, the kind that lasts, is not always immediate. It's often a slow and steady journey. As she set the table, Maggie couldn't help but smile as she watched her grandchildren play. They were so full of energy, running around the house, their laughter filling every corner. She caught Clara's eye, and the two shared a moment of understanding. This was what they had worked for. This was the life they were now building together. "Maggie, this looks wonderful," Clara said, walking over to the table, a soft smile on her lips. "You know I can't cook without a little help," Maggie replied with a wink. "Where's Michael? I thought he was supposed to be setting the table." "He's probably in the living room, talking to the kids," Clara said, shaking her head affectionately. "He gets distracted so easily when they're around." Just as she said that, Michael walked in with a grin on his face, his arms wrapped around their daughter, Ava, who was laughing at something he had said. Maggie's heart swelled as she watched them interact, the bonds between them growing stronger with each passing day. Dinner was a lively affair, with stories being exchanged, laughter ringing through the house, and plenty of good food to go around. After they had finished eating, they gathered in the living room, settling into the familiar routine that had once felt like a distant dream. Maggie, Clara, and Michael sat on the couch, while the grandchildren played on the floor, their toys scattered around them. It was in these quiet, simple moments that Maggie found her greatest joy. She had often wondered if she would ever feel whole again after the pain of being abandoned by her children. But now, sitting here with them, her heart was full in a way it hadn't been in years. She had found something she hadn't thought was possible: peace. "Mom," Michael said, his voice full of emotion, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for us. I know we didn't make it easy for you, and we've had our share of struggles, but we wouldn't be here without you." Maggie looked at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "We've all made mistakes, Michael, but the important thing is that we're here now, together. That's all that matters." Clara reached over and squeezed Maggie's hand. "And we're never going to let go again, Mom. I promise." For the first time in a long time, Maggie felt the full weight of what those words meant. She had spent so many years feeling as though she had been left behind, abandoned by the people she loved most. But now, as she looked around at the faces of her children and grandchildren, she knew that she had been mistaken. She wasn't alone anymore. Over the next few months, Maggie continued to forge stronger bonds with her children. They spent weekends together, going on family outings, and making new memories. There was a new sense of ease between them, a comfort in the knowledge that no matter what happened, they had each other. Maggie also spent more time volunteering at the local senior center, something she had always wanted to do but hadn't had the energy for in the past. It gave her a sense of purpose and connection to others who had experienced the challenges of aging and loneliness. She made new friends and, in turn, found a sense of belonging she had been searching for. Her relationship with Clara continued to grow stronger as well. The two of them had long, heart-to-heart conversations, and Maggie found herself sharing things she hadn't said in years. Clara, in turn, became a source of strength for her. The mother-daughter bond that had once felt fragile was now a foundation, something they could both lean on when the world outside felt overwhelming. One Sunday afternoon, Maggie sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The warm summer breeze tousled her hair, and she smiled as she thought back over the past year. So much had changed. The pain of abandonment, the years of silence, had all begun to fade into the background, replaced by something stronger: love, hope, and connection. Clara joined her on the porch, sitting down beside her with a cup of tea. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. "Mom," Clara said softly, "I know I can't undo the past, but I want you to know how much I love you. I'm so grateful to have you in my life again." Maggie turned to her daughter, her heart full. "I'm grateful too, sweetheart. You've made me believe in second chances." As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle above, Maggie realized that she had found what she had been searching for all along. Not just a home, but a family. And with that, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the love and support of those who mattered most. The road to healing had not been easy, but Maggie had walked it with grace, resilience, and love. She had come out on the other side stronger, more connected, and ready for whatever the future held. She had learned that sometimes the greatest challenges lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Maggie had learned that life had a way of surprising you. Just when you thought you had everything figured out, a new twist would come along. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced the hardest moments of her life, and through it all, she had learned to lean on the one she loved and trust in herself. Now, with her family around her, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. The weather had warmed, and spring was in full bloom. Maggie had spent the last few months tending to her garden, a new hobby she had picked up after she and Clara returned from their trip to the lake. It had started as a way to keep her hands busy, but now, as the flowers bloomed and the vegetables ripened, she realized how much peace it brought her. There was something so satisfying about watching life grow, knowing that she was nurturing it with her own hands. Today, she was sitting in her garden, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves, when Clara came over, a hesitant look on her face. "Mom, can we talk?" Clara asked, sitting down beside her. Maggie put down her gardening tools and turned to face her daughter. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Clara hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot lately about how much things have changed in our family. And, well, I think it's time for me to make a big decision." Maggie furrowed her brow. "What kind of decision?" "I've been offered a promotion at work," Clara said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "It's a great opportunity, but it would mean relocating to another city. I would have to move away, at least for a while. And I'm torn. I know how much we've all been through, and I don't want to leave you behind. But I think this might be what I need to grow." Maggie sat in silence for a moment, letting Clara's words sink in. It was clear that her daughter was struggling with the decision, but Maggie understood. Life had a way of pushing people toward new paths, even when those paths were uncertain and filled with challenges. "You've worked so hard for this, Clara," Maggie said gently, placing a hand on her daughter's. "You deserve to follow your dreams, even if that means going somewhere new. I'll always be here, no matter where you are." Clara's eyes welled up with tears, and she squeezed Maggie's hand. "I don't want to leave you, but I think it's time for me to take this step, Mom. I need to believe in myself the way you've always believed in me." Maggie smiled softly. "I've always believed in you because I know you have the strength to make the right choices. And I'll be here cheering you on, every step of the way." The next few weeks were filled with a mix of emotions. Clara made the decision to accept the promotion, and Maggie knew that her daughter's life was about to change in a big way. It wasn't easy to let go, but Maggie had learned that love wasn't about holding on tightly. It was about supporting the people you loved as they grew, even if it meant letting them go. As the moving day approached, Maggie found herself feeling a mix of pride and sadness. She was proud of the woman Clara had become, proud of the courage it had taken for her to chase her dreams. But at the same time, the thought of her daughter leaving again stirred old feelings of loneliness. On the day Clara was set to leave, Maggie stood in the doorway, watching as her daughter loaded the last of her things into the car. The house felt too quiet, as if the energy had shifted, but Maggie knew that this was just another part of the journey. Clara came over and gave her mother a tight hug. "I'll miss you so much, Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "I'll miss you too," Maggie replied, her heart full. "But you're doing the right thing, and I'm proud of you." Clara pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I'll call you every week. And we'll visit, promise?" Maggie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Promise me one thing, Clara. Don't forget to take care of yourself. You've spent so many years taking care of others. Now it's time for you to do something just for you." "I will, Mom," Clara said with a smile. "I will." As the car pulled away from the house, Maggie stood in the doorway, watching it disappear down the street. A sense of quiet settled over her, and for the first time, she didn't feel an overwhelming sense of loss. Instead, she felt a sense of hope, as though this was the beginning of something new for both of them. Maggie knew that life would continue to change, and sometimes change would come with challenges. But she was ready. She had learned to trust that the love she had built with her family would carry her through, no matter where they went. As she turned back into the house, Maggie found herself filled with a sense of peace. She was stronger than she had ever been, and though the road ahead was unknown, she knew that it would be filled with new opportunities and new beginnings. For the first time in years, Maggie didn't feel alone. After Clara's departure, the house felt emptier, quieter. The busy hum of family life had given way to a serene silence that Maggie hadn't been accustomed to in years. But this time, it wasn't the kind of loneliness that filled her with dread. Instead, there was a calmness that allowed her to reflect on her past, her choices, and the relationships that had shaped her life. Maggie spent the first few weeks after Clara left sorting through old boxes in the attic. It was a way to keep herself occupied, to create a bridge between her present and the past. Dusty photo albums, old letters, and trinkets from years gone by filled the space around her. Each item told a story, memories of her children when they were small, of family gatherings, and of moments that had once felt so important. One particular box caught her eye. It was tucked in the back of the attic, slightly hidden beneath other, more inconspicuous boxes. She lifted the lid and found a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to her, some postmarked years ago. As she carefully unfolded the first letter, her heart skipped a beat. It was from her late husband, George. "My dearest Maggie, I've been thinking a lot about the future, about us. You've always been my anchor, the one thing in my life that makes sense. I know that we've had our differences, but when I look at you, I see a lifetime of love, laughter, and the kind of beauty that can only come from time spent together. I promise you, no matter what happens, I will always be by your side, even when you can't see me. My love for you is eternal. Forever yours, George." Maggie closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. George had passed away years ago, but his memory still lingered in every corner of the house. She had often wondered if her love for him had ever been enough to keep them together, especially during the more difficult times in their marriage. But now, reading his words, she realized something important. Sometimes, love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It was messy, imperfect, but it was real. Later that afternoon, Maggie decided to visit the cemetery. It had been a while since she'd been there. Years, in fact. Life had gotten in the way, and the visits had become less frequent as time passed. But something inside her urged her to go. Perhaps it was the letters, or maybe it was simply the desire to reconnect with her past, to find closure in the places where she had left pieces of herself behind. The cemetery was quiet, the sun low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the rows of gravestones. Maggie made her way to George's plot, her heart heavy but also full of peace. She knelt beside the stone, placing a single white rose on it. "I never forgot you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I never stopped loving you." As she stood up, Maggie felt a strange sense of calm. For years, she had carried around a sense of guilt, wondering if she could have done more, been more, for her husband. But now, in this quiet moment, she realized that their love had been enough. Maybe it hadn't always been perfect, but it had been real, and it had shaped the person she had become. After leaving the cemetery, Maggie took a walk through the town, her steps slow but purposeful. She passed the old cafe where she and George used to meet on Sundays after church, the place where they had shared so many quiet moments together. The window was fogged up, and she could just make out the silhouette of a couple sitting at one of the tables inside. It made her smile. Life moved on, but the memories would always remain. As she walked down Main Street, Maggie ran into Mrs. Lawson, an old friend from her childhood who still lived in the same house across the street from where Maggie grew up. The two women had known each other for years, but time and life had slowly pulled them in different directions. "Well, if it isn't Maggie," Mrs. Lawson exclaimed, her eyes lighting up with surprise and delight. "I haven't seen you around much lately." Maggie smiled warmly. "I've been keeping busy. You know how it is." Mrs. Lawson raised an eyebrow, a knowing look in her eyes. "Oh, I'm sure I do. But it's been a long time. How about you come over for a cup of tea? We can catch up." Maggie hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." At Mrs. Lawson's house, they sat in the cozy kitchen, sipping tea as they talked about old times, childhood memories, friends they had lost touch with, and the people who had shaped their lives. It was as if no time had passed at all. Maggie realized that sometimes reconnecting with the past didn't just mean revisiting places or objects. It meant revisiting the people who had once been a part of your world. And in doing so, you could rediscover pieces of yourself you had forgotten. "You know," Mrs. Lawson said thoughtfully as they sat together, "we're never too old to make new memories. Life has a funny way of throwing us unexpected gifts if we're open to them." Maggie smiled, feeling a sense of warmth and comfort. "I think I'm starting to see that." When Maggie returned home that evening, she felt lighter somehow. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, she didn't feel burdened by the weight of her past. Instead, she felt empowered by it, by the lessons it had taught her, and the love it had given her. Reconnecting with old memories and old friends had reminded her that life was still full of possibilities, even in her later years. She stood in the garden for a moment, taking in the beauty of the flowers she had planted months ago. It was a reminder that life was always growing, changing, and evolving, and that she was too. Maggie woke up to a crisp morning, the sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, casting a warm golden glow over the room. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of clarity. The past year had been a whirlwind of emotions, grief, joy, loss, and renewal. But now, as she stretched and took in the stillness of her home, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. After her conversation with Mrs. Lawson, Maggie had spent a lot of time reflecting on her life. The years of sacrifice, the struggles, and the triumphs had led her to this moment. She had raised 6 children, faced the unexpected loss of her husband, and learned to navigate the world on her own. But now, she realized something important. Her life wasn't over. It was simply evolving. Maggie had always been a caretaker, always putting others first. But now, she was learning to take care of herself, to embrace the things that made her happy, and to explore new possibilities. Her heart was open, and for the first time in years, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. A few weeks later, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, scrolling through a local community newsletter. As she read through the events happening around town, a flyer caught her eye: Creative Writing Workshop, Discover the Writer in You. It was being offered at the local community center, starting next week. Maggie paused for a moment, considering writing. She had always loved reading, always loved stories, but she had never thought of herself as a writer. But something about the idea sparked something deep within her. Maybe it was time to explore this part of herself, to try something new and see where it took her. Without thinking twice, she grabbed her phone and signed up for the class. The first day of the writing workshop arrived, and Maggie found herself standing in front of the community center, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. It felt strange, stepping into a new world where she didn't know anyone. She had spent so many years focused on her family that it had been a long time since she had done something solely for herself. As she walked into the room, she was greeted by a small group of people, all seated around a large table. There were young people, older people, and everyone in between. The instructor, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, smiled at her and welcomed her warmly. "Hi, I'm Maggie," she said, sitting down at an empty seat. "Nice to meet you, Maggie," the instructor replied. We're so glad you could join us today. We're all here to share our stories, so don't be shy. Let's get started. Over the next few weeks, Maggie immersed herself in the workshop. At first, she felt hesitant, unsure of what she had to offer. But as the class progressed, she began to open up. She wrote about her life, about her childhood, her marriage to George, the challenges of raising 6 children, and the joy of becoming a grandmother. Slowly, she discovered that writing was a way for her to process her emotions, to make sense of the years that had shaped her. One day, the instructor asked the class to share a piece of writing that had particularly resonated with them. Maggie, though nervous, raised her hand. "I'd like to share something," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's about the time my husband and I went on a trip to the lake before he passed away. It's one of my most cherished memories." As she read her piece aloud, the room grew quiet. Maggie's voice trembled with emotion, but she continued. The words flowed from her heart, and when she finished, she looked up to see everyone in the room staring at her, their eyes filled with admiration. "That was beautiful, Maggie," the instructor said softly. "You have such a gift for storytelling." Maggie felt a rush of warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she realized that her life, the memories, the stories, had value. They were worth sharing, worth telling, and in doing so, she felt a deeper connection not only to herself but to the world around her. Weeks turned into months, and Maggie continued to write. Her stories grew more vivid, more detailed, and more personal. She began to share them with her family, her children, and even Clara, who had settled into her new city. They were amazed at how much Maggie had grown, at how much she had to offer the world beyond being a mother and grandmother. One evening, as Maggie was sitting in the living room, typing away at her laptop, Clara called. "Mom," Clara said, her voice full of excitement, "I have something to tell you. They've offered me a permanent position in the city. And guess what? They want me to start a new department, one that focuses on community outreach. It's a huge opportunity, and I couldn't have done it without your encouragement." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Clara. You're doing amazing things." "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," Clara replied. "You've always taught me to follow my dreams, no matter how hard it is. Now I see that it's not just about the job. It's about finding purpose and fulfillment in everything I do. You've shown me that." Maggie leaned back in her chair, taking in her daughter's words. She realized that, in many ways, they were on the same journey. Both of them were discovering their passions, their strengths, and their purpose in life, and they were doing it together, even if they were miles apart. As Maggie continued to write, she began to see the world through new eyes. She embraced her own creativity, the stories that lived within her, and the joy that came from sharing them with others. She knew there was still much more to discover, both about herself and about the world. But for now, she was content. She was writing, living, and learning, one chapter at a time. And as the seasons changed and her life continued to evolve, Maggie knew one thing for sure. She was never too old to start something new. She had only just begun. Maggie sat on the porch one evening, the cool autumn air brushing her face as she gazed out at the horizon. The vibrant orange and red leaves swirled gently in the wind, signaling the arrival of a new season. It had been several months since she had signed up for the creative writing workshop, and in that time, so much had changed. The future, once uncertain and filled with doubt, now seemed open to endless possibilities. Her writing had blossomed. The small stories she had started with were growing into something deeper, something more profound. Maggie began to write about more than just her past. She wrote about her hopes for the future, her dreams, and her reflections on the lessons life had taught her. Each word was a step forward, a reminder that she was still capable of creating, of making a mark in the world, even at this stage of her life. But there was one thing Maggie hadn't anticipated: the way her writing would affect her relationship with her children. Clara, especially, had become her biggest supporter. They spoke on the phone more often now, sharing their thoughts not just about family but about the future and their passions. Clara even sent her articles about writing contests and published works, encouraging her to submit her pieces. One afternoon, Clara called with an idea that made Maggie's heart skip a beat. "Mom, I have a proposal for you." What do you think about publishing a book? You've written so much already, and I really think you could do something special with it. We could work together on getting it out there." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She had never imagined her writing would go beyond the pages of her journals or the small community workshops. "You really think it's worth publishing?" she asked, her voice filled with both excitement and fear. "Absolutely," Clara replied with conviction. "I've read some of your stories, and I think they would resonate with so many people. Plus, it's a great way to share your journey. You've been through so much, and I think it could inspire others." Maggie spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions. The idea of publishing a book was daunting, but Clara's encouragement gave her the confidence to consider it. She began to sift through her stories, picking out the ones that felt the most meaningful, the ones that not only captured the essence of her life, but could also speak to others. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of wondering if anyone would care about her story. But as she wrote, she remembered the faces of the people in her writing workshop, how their eyes had lit up with understanding, how her words had connected them to their own lives. She realized that her voice mattered, and that it was time to share it with a wider audience. Weeks later, Maggie completed her manuscript. It was a collection of stories, some lighthearted, others poignant, all deeply personal. It was a piece of her heart laid bare for the world to see. She sent it off to a local publishing company, her fingers trembling as she clicked send. It was done. All she could do now was wait. During this time, Maggie also focused on nurturing herself. She continued to write, but she also spent more time outdoors, taking long walks through the park or sitting by the lake, watching the sunset. It was important to her now to savor these moments of peace. Life, with all its unpredictability, had taught her that the most important thing was to live in the present, to appreciate the small things. One afternoon, while Maggie was working in the garden, she received an email from the publishing company. Her heart raced as she opened it, her eyes scanning the words. "Dear Maggie, thank you for submitting your manuscript. We are pleased to inform you that we would like to move forward with publishing your book. Your stories are heartfelt and resonant, and we believe they will connect deeply with readers. We look forward to working with you on this exciting project." Maggie couldn't believe it. After all these years of writing for herself, her work was finally going to be shared with the world. She jumped up, a joyous laugh escaping her lips as she raised her arms in triumph. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The house, the quiet streets, the years of waiting. It was as if time had stopped, and Maggie was standing on the edge of a new chapter in her life. As the months passed, Maggie worked closely with the publishing company. There were edits to be made, decisions to be discussed, and cover designs to review. Every step brought her closer to the realization that this was more than just a book. It was a culmination of everything she had experienced. The challenges, the love, the heartbreak, and the strength that had carried her through it all. Her family rallied behind her, especially Clara, who flew in for a special visit during the final stages of the process. The day the book was published, Maggie held a small launch party at the community center, inviting friends, family, and those who had been part of her writing journey. It was a celebration not just of her book, but of the strength and resilience that had allowed her to reach this moment. As Maggie stood in front of the crowd, holding her book in her hands, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had spent so many years taking care of others, but now, for the first time in her life, she had taken care of herself. She had followed her dreams, even when it seemed impossible, and in doing so, she had discovered a new version of herself, one that was bold, creative, and full of possibility. Looking around at the faces of her children, her friends, and even strangers who had come to support her, Maggie realized that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had stood by her side, encouraging her, helping her rediscover her strength. "Thank you, all of you," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. "This book is for all of us. It's proof that no matter how old we are, there's always a new road ahead. And it's never too late to start something new." As she looked at the smiling faces of her loved ones, Maggie knew one thing for sure. The road ahead was hers to walk, and it was full of endless possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, she was ready to see where it would take her. Maggie sat at her kitchen table, the warm glow of the lamp above casting soft shadows on the pages of her book. As the final copies of her memoir arrived, she felt a rush of emotion. Her fingers hovered over the cover, tracing the title, A Mother's Journey, Stories of Love, Loss, and Renewal. It wasn't just a title. It was the essence of her life, a reflection of the highs and lows, the memories she had stored deep within her heart. The weeks following the book's publication had been a blur of interviews, book signings, and media attention. Maggie was surprised by how quickly her story had resonated with others. Her book was not just another memoir. It was a raw, authentic account of resilience, the strength of a mother, and the unbreakable bond that family can create even through the hardest of times. But as Maggie flipped through the pages, one part of the journey stood out to her more than any other. The chapter about her children. When she had started writing her memoir, she hadn't fully realized how much her relationship with her kids, both the pain of their abandonment and the love they had rediscovered, would shape the book. She had written about the empty nest, about the loneliness she had felt as her children grew older and drifted away. She had poured her heart into those pages, recounting the emotional moments of losing them, and the eventual breakthrough when Clara returned and their family started to heal. In the quiet of the night, Maggie thought back to the day when she had realized that her love for her children, though tested, was unwavering. She thought of the moment Clara had called, announcing her promotion in the city. That had been a turning point, when she finally understood that her children's lives, their dreams, were as important as her own. She had to let them go, to give them the space to grow and flourish, just as they had once needed from her. Clara's success, and the way she had come back to support her mother, had given Maggie the courage to believe that healing, both for her and her family, was possible. When Maggie sat down to write about their relationship, she poured all her feelings into the words. She wrote about the pain of watching them leave, but she also wrote about the joy she found in seeing them thrive, knowing that she had given them everything they needed to succeed. It was these very stories that touched the hearts of readers. They saw themselves in Maggie's words, in her struggles with motherhood, her desire to be loved, and her ultimate realization that the love she had given her children was never wasted. It had shaped them into the people they had become. Maggie's phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Clara. "Mom, I just finished reading the chapter you wrote about me. I can't even explain how much it means to me. I always knew you were strong, but I had no idea how much you were holding inside. I'm so proud of you. I love you." Maggie smiled through her tears. She had been so afraid of revealing her vulnerabilities in her book, especially when it came to her children. But Clara's words told her everything she needed to know. It was worth it. By opening her heart, she had not only healed herself, but she had created a bridge for her children to see her in a way they hadn't before. In the weeks that followed, Maggie began receiving letters and messages from readers who were deeply moved by her book. Many shared their own stories of loss, reconciliation, and personal growth. Some had been estranged from their families, others had lost their own mothers, and still, others had been through hardships they thought they would never overcome. But Maggie's story of love and forgiveness had given them hope. One letter, in particular, stood out to her. It was from a woman named Sarah, who wrote about the long separation from her own mother, whom she hadn't spoken to in over a decade. "Dear Maggie, your story gave me the courage to pick up the phone and call my mom after all these years. I can't tell you how much I needed to hear that it's never too late to rebuild a relationship. Thank you for sharing your heart. You've given me hope, and that's something I thought I had lost forever. Sincerely, Sarah." Maggie sat in silence after reading the letter, feeling a mixture of gratitude and awe. She had always believed in the power of love and family, but now, she saw how her own journey had become part of something larger than herself. She had given others the strength to find healing, just as she had found it within herself. As the year went on, Maggie continued to write, but now, there was an even deeper sense of purpose to her work. She didn't just write to process her own emotions, but to help others who were struggling with their own challenges. She had created a space for people to come together through their shared experiences, and that was the greatest gift of all. Her relationship with her children continued to grow stronger. Clara, now fully settled in the city, made regular trips back to visit her mother, and they spent hours talking about life, love, and the future. Maggie's other children, too, began to reconnect, each in their own way, as they read her book and began to understand her more deeply. Maggie knew that the road ahead was still full of unknowns. There would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt. But as she looked back on her journey, she realized that the most important thing she had learned was that she didn't have to face those challenges alone. She had her family, her friends, and the love of countless readers who had embraced her story. That night, as Maggie lay in bed, she thought about all the years she had spent wondering if her life had mattered. And now, as she drifted off to sleep, she knew the answer. Her life had mattered. Every moment, every sacrifice, every story she had shared. It had all been part of something bigger, and that was enough. Maggie stood at the window, watching the first signs of dawn break through the dark sky. The city outside was slowly coming to life. Cars on the road, people jogging along the park, the hum of everyday life carrying into her quiet apartment. It had been a few months since her book had been published, and things had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. But now, as the sun began to rise, Maggie felt a sense of calm she hadn't known before. Her life was finally in balance. It wasn't that things were perfect. Life, she had come to understand, was never perfect. There would always be challenges, struggles, and moments of doubt. But what mattered now was how she viewed those challenges. With the love and support of her children and readers, Maggie had learned to face each obstacle with a sense of purpose. She was no longer running from her past, but embracing it, learning from it, and moving forward. The success of her book had opened doors she never imagined. She had been invited to speak at conferences, to lead workshops on resilience and healing, and even to share her journey in local news outlets. Every time she spoke, whether it was in front of a crowd of strangers or a group of friends, Maggie found herself not only sharing her story but hearing the stories of others. She felt connected to the world in a way she never had before. But there was one thing Maggie still needed to do. It had been a few months since she had last seen her oldest son, Michael. He had always been the one to push her away the most, the one who had struggled the hardest with their family dynamics. The last time they spoke, it was after the publication of her book, and they had exchanged a few brief, strained words. But Maggie felt a deep sense of unfinished business. She couldn't rest until she had truly mended their bond, until she had fully healed the relationship that had once been so full of love, but had been torn apart by misunderstandings and distance. Clara had encouraged her to reach out. "He needs you, Mom. You've come so far, and I know he's proud of you. But he's hurting, too." Maggie knew Clara was right. Michael had always been sensitive, protective in his own way, but the years had hardened him. The arguments, the misunderstandings, they had pushed him away. But Maggie was ready now, ready to face the hard truth that healing wasn't just about forgiving. It was about reaching out, even when it felt impossible. One afternoon, Maggie found herself sitting down at her desk, pen in hand, as she composed a letter to Michael. She wanted to make it personal, something that spoke from her heart without pressure, without expectation. "Dear Michael, I've thought a lot about what we've been through, and I know I made mistakes. I'm sorry for not always being the mother you needed, and for not understanding how hard it was for you when we were growing up. I know you're your own person now, and I don't want to interfere with your life. But I miss you, Michael. I miss the son I used to know, and I would love to reconnect, if you're open to it. I'm proud of the person you've become, even though we've had our differences. I'm here, whenever you're ready. With love, Mom." She sealed the letter and placed it in an envelope, feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. Maggie had done what she could. The ball was now in Michael's court. Whether he responded or not, she would respect his space, but she knew she couldn't let go of this part of her heart without trying. Days passed. Maggie continued with her routine, writing, teaching workshops, speaking at events. But in the back of her mind, she kept wondering about Michael. What was he doing? Had he received her letter? Had it touched him? Then, one evening, as Maggie was finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, there stood Michael. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I got your letter." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She could see the weight of years of distance in his eyes, but there was something else there, too. Hope. A glimmer of understanding. Without a word, Maggie opened her arms. Michael hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and hugging her tightly. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I didn't know how to come back, but I've been reading your book and I see things differently now. I'm proud of you, too, and I want to try again." Maggie felt a flood of relief wash over her. She had waited so long for this moment, and now, finally, it was happening. She knew there was still work to be done. Healing takes time, but this was the first step toward rebuilding a bond that had been broken for too long. The following weeks were filled with small steps forward. Maggie and Michael began to talk more, to share their thoughts, their fears, and their hopes for the future. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when old wounds would resurface, but Maggie had learned that healing didn't mean perfection. It meant progress. It meant showing up, even when it was hard. And so, they continued to rebuild. Slowly but surely, Maggie was coming full circle. She had rediscovered her strength, had healed her relationship with her children, and had found a sense of purpose that went beyond her past. Her journey, once defined by loss and abandonment, was now one of renewal and hope. As Maggie sat in her favorite chair, looking out at the world beyond her window, she smiled softly to herself. She had faced the darkness, and now, with her children beside her, she was finally stepping into the light. Maggie sat quietly at her dining table, the evening light streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. It had been a month since Michael had come to visit, and already, she felt a shift in the air around her. There was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. It was as if the wounds of the past were starting to close, healing with time and effort. But there was still one more thing she needed to do. Maggie had always believed that forgiveness was one of the most powerful forces in the world. She had learned that the hard way, through years of bitterness, pain, and broken relationships. But she had also learned that forgiveness wasn't just about letting others off the hook. It was about freeing herself. It was about finding peace, even when things didn't go the way she had hoped. Her relationship with Michael had improved, but there was still one person Maggie hadn't fully forgiven. One person she hadn't let go of. Herself. The more Maggie reflected on the years of her life, the more she realized how much guilt she had carried with her. Guilt for not being the perfect mother, guilt for the mistakes she had made, guilt for not being able to fix everything. She had always tried so hard to give her children everything they needed, but there had been moments, many moments, when she felt like she had fallen short. The years of sacrifice, of putting her children's needs ahead of her own, had left her with a deep sense of self-doubt. She had carried that burden silently, believing that if she had only done more, been more, everything might have turned out differently. But now, with the love and support of her children, and with the clarity of time, she saw things differently. The mistakes, the misunderstandings, the moments of failure, they were part of her journey, part of what made her who she was. And they didn't define her. Maggie closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It was time to forgive herself. She decided to start with a letter. It wasn't to anyone else, but to herself. She needed to put her feelings into words, to release the guilt that had been weighing her down for so long. It wasn't going to be easy, but she knew it was the next step in her healing process. Dear Maggie, I know you've been holding on to the past, blaming yourself for things you couldn't control. You've been carrying the weight of your mistakes, believing they define you. But I want you to know, once and for all, that you are not defined by your failures. You gave everything for your children, for your family. You did your best, and sometimes that was enough. You don't need to carry the burden of guilt anymore. It's okay to forgive yourself. It's okay to let go. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of peace. And you are worthy of the future you are creating. With love, yourself. Maggie smiled softly as she reread the letter. It wasn't perfect, it didn't fix everything, and it didn't erase the pain of the past. But it was a step toward healing. A step toward releasing the past and embracing the present, with all its possibilities. The following day, Maggie met Clara for lunch at their favorite cafe. Over a bowl of soup and warm bread, Clara asked, "So, how are you really doing, Mom? With everything that's been happening?" Maggie took a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "I think I'm finally starting to forgive myself. I've carried so much guilt for so long, and I'm realizing that it's not serving me. It's time to let go." Clara's eyes softened, and she reached across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. "I'm so proud of you, Mom. I can see how much you've grown, and you're not alone. We're all in this together." Maggie felt a swell of emotion in her chest. She had spent so many years feeling isolated in her pain, but now she had her children, her family, and the love they shared. The journey had been long, and at times, it had felt impossible, but Maggie had made it through. And more importantly, she had come out on the other side stronger than she had ever been before. That evening, as Maggie sat in her living room, her thoughts turned to the future. There was so much more she wanted to do, so much more she could give, so much more she could experience. She had spent so much of her life looking back, worrying about what had gone wrong, but now she was ready to look forward. Her phone buzzed with a message from Michael. It was simple, but it filled Maggie's heart with warmth. "Hey, Mom, I've been thinking a lot about the past lately. I just wanted to thank you for never giving up on me. I'm proud of you, and I love you." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. It wasn't just that Michael had come around. It was that they were finally meeting each other halfway. They were learning to forgive, to understand, and to love each other in a way that they hadn't been able to before. The next morning, Maggie went for a walk in the park, breathing in the fresh air. The trees were just beginning to bloom, and the world around her felt full of possibility. As she walked, she thought about everything she had learned: the importance of forgiveness, the strength of family, the power of love. She had spent so many years searching for answers, for peace, for closure. But now, she understood that the answers weren't always easy, and the peace didn't come all at once. It came in small steps. It came in forgiveness, in letting go of the past and embracing the present. As Maggie walked along the path, she paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the world around her. There would still be challenges ahead. She knew that. But she also knew that she was no longer facing them alone. And that, she realized, was enough. The months passed by quickly for Maggie, each day bringing new opportunities for growth, healing, and connection. She had never imagined she would feel so at peace, so content with the life she had built after everything that had happened. Her children were thriving, her relationships were stronger, and her book, her story, had touched countless lives. But there was one thing Maggie had yet to fully embrace: the idea that her story, her journey, could leave a legacy that went beyond her own lifetime. She had always been focused on survival, getting through each day, facing the next challenge, hoping to build a better future for her children. Now, she was beginning to realize that the legacy she left behind didn't have to be about grand gestures or monumental achievements. It could be about the small, everyday acts of love and kindness that had shaped her life and her family. One afternoon, as she was sitting on her porch, reflecting on the changes that had taken place in her life, Clara came by for a visit. Maggie had grown used to Clara's regular visits, and they had become a comforting routine. Over cups of tea and shared laughter, they would talk about everything: family, dreams, the future. Today, however, the conversation turned in a new direction. "Mom," Clara began, setting her tea down with a thoughtful look, "I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what you've taught me, and I've realized something important. You've created a legacy, one that will live on, not just through your book or your journey, but through the way you love." Maggie raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Clara smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the warmth of understanding. "All those years you spent giving everything to us, even when you had nothing left. All the times you forgave. All the times you kept moving forward no matter how hard it got. You didn't just teach us to survive. You taught us to love unconditionally. That's the real legacy, Mom." Maggie's heart swelled with emotion. She had always wondered what her children would remember about her. What would they carry with them into their own lives? What would be the most important lesson they took away from everything they had been through together? And Clara's words, those simple but powerful words, reminded Maggie of something she had known all along but had never fully acknowledged. Love wasn't just about big gestures or dramatic moments. It was about the quiet, consistent presence of someone who cared deeply, who showed up even when it was difficult, who forgave, and who never stopped giving. That evening, Maggie sat down to write. It wasn't a letter this time, nor an article for her blog. It was something more personal, a reflection on her life, her journey, and the legacy she wanted to leave behind. She wrote with the quiet understanding that she didn't need to accomplish everything or have all the answers to make a difference. The love she had given her children, the lessons she had taught them, were already shaping the world in ways she hadn't fully realized. Dear family, if you're reading this, then I hope you know how much I love you. It's not just about the words I say or the things I've done. It's about the moments in between, the quiet, everyday moments where I try to show you what really matters: love, forgiveness, resilience, and the belief that even when life is hard, we can find our way through it together. You all have taught me so much, and I hope, as you move forward in your lives, you remember that the most important thing we can do is love each other, no matter what. That's the legacy I leave: love, and all the ways we've shared it together. With all my heart, Mom. Maggie finished writing the note and set her pen down, feeling a sense of finality that she hadn't expected. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Her legacy wasn't something she needed to achieve in the future. It was already unfolding, in the love she shared with her family, in the lessons she had imparted, and in the strength they had all found together. A few days later, Maggie took her family to a local park. It was a sunny afternoon, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter, children running and playing, families gathering for picnics. They found a quiet spot near a tree, where Maggie spread a blanket and they all sat together. It was a simple moment, but it was perfect. As they sat in the shade, Maggie looked around at her children, now grown, with their own lives, their own families. She thought about all they had been through, how far they had come, how much they had all changed. And in that moment, she realized that the legacy she had feared losing was already in place. It wasn't something she needed to hold on to. It was something that would live on in each of them, in the ways they loved, in the ways they cared for each other, in the lessons they had learned from their own mother. Later that evening, after the children had gone home, Maggie sat on the porch once more, watching the stars twinkle in the sky. Her heart felt full. She was content, at peace with the journey she had taken, and with the family she had helped build. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more lessons to learn, but for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt that everything was as it should be. The legacy of love she had created was not just a part of her past. It was the very foundation of her future. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Maggie found herself standing in front of a small, cozy cottage on the outskirts of town. The air was crisp, the scent of dew still hanging in the morning breeze. She had never imagined herself living in a place like this, peaceful, quiet, and surrounded by nature. Yet, here she was, ready to take the next step in her life. It was time for a new beginning. For years, Maggie had lived in the family home, where the echoes of her children's laughter and the memories of her own life struggles had filled every corner. But now, with her children all grown and her own journey of healing well underway, she had decided it was time to move on. The house had served its purpose. It had been the heart of her family, a place where love, pain, and joy had all coexisted. But now, Maggie needed a space that was hers, a place where she could nurture the next chapter of her life. This cottage, with its wooden beams and ivy-covered walls, was perfect. Maggie had spent the past few weeks preparing for the move, packing up her belongings, going through old photographs, and reminiscing about the years that had passed. There was a sense of nostalgia, yes, but it wasn't the kind that weighed her down. It was a nostalgic gratitude, grateful for the life she had lived, for the family she had raised, and for the lessons she had learned along the way. She was proud of what she had built, but she was ready to create something new. As she stepped inside the cottage for the first time, Maggie was immediately struck by how different it felt from her old home. The space was smaller, more intimate, but it felt like a breath of fresh air. The light poured in through the windows, and the room seemed to invite her in, offering a sense of possibility and peace. There was no clutter here, no remnants of the past, no heavy weight of memories. It was an empty canvas, waiting for her to paint her next chapter. Maggie made her way to the kitchen, where a simple wood stove stood in the corner. She imagined herself cooking here, preparing meals for family and friends, filling the room with the warmth of love and care. The cottage was a place where she could slow down, reflect, and embrace the simple joys of life: gardening, reading, and spending time with the people she loved. There would be no rush here, no constant pressure to do more, be more. This was her sanctuary. The decision to move had not been an easy one. There had been moments of doubt, moments when Maggie wondered if she was making a mistake. But she had learned over the years that change, though difficult, was often necessary for growth. And she knew that she was ready for this new beginning. Later that day, Clara and Michael came by to help Maggie settle into the cottage. They had both supported her through this transition, and they were eager to see the new chapter in her life unfold. Clara had brought a basket of freshly baked bread, and Michael had come with a box of her favorite books, knowing how much she loved to read in the quiet moments. As they unpacked and arranged her belongings, the conversation turned to the future. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," Michael said, placing a framed photo of their family on a small table. "I know it wasn't easy, but you've really created something beautiful here. This place is perfect for you." Maggie smiled, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Thank you, Michael. It feels right. It's my space now, where I can breathe and think. It's a new beginning for me." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You've always put everyone else first, Mom. Now it's time for you to focus on what makes you happy. And I know you're going to make the most of this." Maggie couldn't help but feel a surge of love for her children. They had always been her reason for everything, but now, as they stood beside her in this new chapter of her life, she realized how much they had become a reflection of the love and wisdom she had given them. She had raised them to be strong, compassionate, and independent, and now they were supporting her as she took this next step for herself. That evening, as the sun began to set, Maggie sat on the porch of the cottage, a cup of tea in hand, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. There was a sense of serenity that she hadn't known in years. The past was behind her, and the future was full of possibility. She felt a sense of excitement stirring within her, excitement for what was to come, for the new experiences and relationships she would create. The next day, Maggie began unpacking her journals and old letters. She had always written down her thoughts, her dreams, her reflections on life. Now, in this new space, those words would take on new meaning. She was beginning a new chapter, but it didn't mean that the past was forgotten. It meant that she was carrying everything she had learned with her, while allowing herself the freedom to move forward. As the days went by, Maggie found herself settling into a comfortable rhythm. She spent her mornings tending to a small garden she had started outside, planting flowers and herbs that reminded her of her childhood. She took long walks in the nearby woods, enjoying the peace and solitude that the cottage offered. And in the evenings, she would curl up with a good book or write in her journal, reflecting on the day and all that she had learned. Maggie wasn't just creating a home. She was creating a life that was hers to shape, to nurture, and to enjoy. And as she looked out over the peaceful landscape that stretched before her, she couldn't help but feel that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The future was uncertain, as it always is, but for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt a deep sense of calm. She had spent so many years looking back, holding on to the past, trying to fix things that were beyond her control. But now, in this quiet cottage, Maggie was learning to look forward, to embrace the unknown with an open heart. And she knew that no matter what came next, she was ready. As the days grew warmer, Maggie's life in the cottage began to take on a rhythm that felt both comforting and new. The small acts of self-care, the quiet mornings with a cup of tea and the soothing sound of birdsong outside, had become part of her daily routine. Yet, despite the peace she had found, there was still a part of her, deep inside, that hesitated to fully embrace the future. She had spent so many years focused on surviving, on making sure that everyone around her was taken care of, that the idea of truly living for herself was still something she was learning to navigate. It was easy to feel stuck in the comfort of routine, to avoid the uncertainties of what lay ahead. But Maggie knew that to live fully, she needed to let go of the fear and step into the unknown. One late afternoon, Maggie decided to take a walk into the nearby town. She had passed through it several times since moving to the cottage, but she had never really explored it. It was a quaint town, filled with small shops, a cafe with outdoor seating, and a community that seemed tightly knit. As she walked down the cobbled streets, Maggie felt a sense of both curiosity and anticipation. What if she could find a new connection here? What if this was the place where she could begin to build something beyond her past? Her heart raced as she stepped into a little bookstore tucked between a bakery and a florist shop. The warm scent of coffee and old books greeted her as she entered. The shop was cozy, filled with shelves stacked high with novels, poetry, and history. Maggie had always loved reading, and as she browsed the shelves, she realized how much she had missed the act of getting lost in a story. As she picked up a book on a nearby shelf, a voice broke her reverie. "Well, hello there," said an elderly woman, smiling warmly at Maggie. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." Maggie smiled back, feeling a bit shy but welcomed. "I just moved to the cottage outside town. I thought I'd come explore a bit." The woman's eyes lit up. "Ah, a newcomer. Welcome, welcome. I'm Eleanor, the owner of this little bookstore. I must say, there's something special about newcomers around here. They always bring a fresh perspective." She paused and then added with a wink, "Or at least, we hope they do." Maggie chuckled, feeling at ease. "It's a lovely town. I'm still getting to know it." Eleanor nodded. "Well, take your time. There's no rush. It's the kind of place that rewards patience. You'll find your rhythm soon enough." She walked over to a nearby shelf and pulled out a book, handing it to Maggie. "This one's a favorite of mine. I think you might enjoy it." Maggie took the book from her hands and glanced at the title, The Art of Letting Go. It felt like an omen, a sign that perhaps she had come here for more than just the books. Over the next few weeks, Maggie made it a point to visit Eleanor's bookstore whenever she could. Each time, the two women would sit together and chat, discussing everything from books to life. Eleanor had lived in the town for decades, and her wisdom and perspective had a calming effect on Maggie. It was through these conversations that Maggie began to realize something important. Life was not just about finding answers. It was about embracing the questions, the uncertainties, the journey. Eleanor shared her own story of moving to the town when she was younger, how she had taken risks and ventured into the unknown, leaving behind a life she had outgrown. "I think the key to really living," Eleanor said one afternoon as they sipped tea in the bookstore's small cafe corner, "is to stop looking for the perfect moment, the perfect place, the perfect situation. You just have to step forward, even when you don't know where you're going." Maggie nodded, the weight of Eleanor's words settling in her heart. She realized that for so long, she had been waiting for something to change before she could truly embrace her life. But the truth was, change wasn't something that happened to her. It was something she had to choose for herself. The following week, Maggie made a decision. She was going to step out of her comfort zone. She was going to start something new, something that allowed her to connect with the world in a way she never had before. She had always been a writer, but she had never truly shared her work outside of her family. Now, with her life in transition, she felt ready to take that leap. She reached out to a local writing group that Eleanor had recommended, a small but vibrant community of writers who met regularly to share their work and provide support. Maggie hesitated before hitting send on the email, unsure of how her work would be received. But then she thought of Eleanor's words, "You just have to step forward." To her surprise, she received a warm welcome from the group. They were eager to meet her, to hear her story, and to see what she had written. That evening, Maggie attended her first meeting. Her nerves were palpable, but there was also a sense of excitement, a sense of stepping into a new chapter that was entirely her own. As the weeks passed, Maggie found herself becoming more involved in the writing group. She shared stories, listened to others, and grew more confident in her ability to express herself. The members of the group became a source of inspiration and support. Maggie realized that these new connections were not just about writing. They were about learning to open her heart to new experiences, new people, and new possibilities. She began to see that embracing the unknown didn't mean having everything figured out. It meant having the courage to move forward, even when the path was unclear, and trusting that life would reveal its beauty along the way. One evening, as Maggie sat by the window in her cottage, her pen in hand, she reflected on how far she had come. Her life had been shaped by so many twists and turns, but now, She was finally learning to live in the moment, to embrace the unknown with an open heart. And as she looked out over the horizon, she realized that the future was not something to fear. It was something to embrace, with all its uncertainty, its beauty, and its potential. As the seasons began to change and the air grew cooler, Maggie's life continued to unfold in ways she never could have imagined. Her days were filled with moments of quiet reflection and new experiences, but it was the people around her, those she had come to know in the small town, that made this new chapter truly special. Maggie had always valued family, even before the challenges that came with raising her 6 children. But now, as her own children lived far away and she had embraced the peace of her new home, she realized that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who cared for you, who stood by your side, who helped you grow. And here, in this town, she had found a new kind of family. One evening, as Maggie was returning from a walk along the river, she was greeted by the sight of her neighbors, Joe and Sarah, sitting on their porch. They were an older couple who had lived in the town for years, and they had welcomed Maggie with open arms when she first moved in. Joe was a retired mechanic with a great sense of humor, and Sarah was a retired schoolteacher with a heart of gold. Their warmth had become a constant source of comfort for Maggie, and their friendship was something she treasured deeply. "Good evening, Maggie," Sarah called out from the porch, her voice full of cheer. "Evening, Sarah." "Evening, Joe," Maggie replied, walking up the path to join them. Joe gave a knowing smile. "Out for your evening stroll again, Maggie? You're certainly getting your exercise around here." Maggie chuckled. "It's the only way to keep up with all the new changes. But I'm starting to feel like I belong here." Sarah patted the seat next to her. "Of course you do. We're glad you're here with us. You know, Joe and I have been talking. We'd like to invite you over for dinner tomorrow. A little home-cooked meal, just the 3 of us. What do you say?" Maggie felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Since moving to the cottage, she had spent most of her time by herself, settling in and adjusting. But the offer of a shared meal, a time to connect, felt like a gift. "I'd love that, Sarah. Thank you." The next evening, Maggie arrived at Joe and Sarah's home, which was a modest yet charming house with a beautiful garden in the back. The smell of freshly baked bread and roasted vegetables wafted through the air as she knocked on their door. Sarah greeted her with a warm embrace, and soon the 3 of them were sitting at the kitchen table, sharing stories and laughter over dinner. As they ate, Sarah shared tales of the town's history, how it had grown over the years, the families that had come and gone, and the bonds that had been formed. Joe, with his easygoing demeanor, cracked jokes and made Maggie laugh, and she found herself enjoying the evening more than she had anticipated. The conversation turned to Maggie's writing group, and Sarah was curious to hear more about it. Maggie eagerly told them about her experiences, how she had found a community of fellow writers who had encouraged her to share her work and express herself. Joe, ever the supportive friend, told her how proud he was of her for taking that step. "You know, Maggie," Sarah said thoughtfully, "it's never too late to find your place in the world. You've always had such a big heart, and I can see you pouring that heart into your writing. I think you're exactly where you're meant to be." Maggie's eyes filled with emotion. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she had been searching for a sense of belonging, how much she had craved connection. And now, in the company of Joe and Sarah, she felt it. This wasn't just a small town. It was a community of people who truly cared for one another. Over the following weeks, Maggie's bond with Joe and Sarah deepened. They invited her over for dinner regularly, and she began to help them with small tasks around their house, gardening, organizing, and even baking bread together. She found herself looking forward to their time together, where they would talk about everything from life's joys to its challenges. It wasn't long before Maggie realized that this was the family she had been yearning for. It wasn't a replacement for her own children, but rather an extension of the love and care she had always given. Joe and Sarah had become like parents to her, offering her support and wisdom when she needed it. And as she spent more time with them, she saw how their kindness had shaped the community around them. One day, as Maggie was helping Sarah plant flowers in her garden, the conversation turned to something more personal. "Maggie, we know it's not always easy," Sarah said, wiping her brow. "But you've made such a difference here. You've brought something new to our lives. You've brought your light. Maggie paused, her heart swelling with gratitude. I've just been trying to find my place in the world again, and you two have made it so much easier. Joe, who had been working on the fence nearby, called out with a grin, You've got a good heart, Maggie. That's why we've all come to care for you. We're lucky to have you here. In that moment, Maggie felt the weight of her journey. From being abandoned and left alone, to now finding love and belonging in the most unexpected places, her life had come full circle. She realized that while her children may have distanced themselves, she had found something equally important, a community that was not defined by blood, but by the connections and bonds formed through love and kindness. And as she looked out over the garden, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. The future, though uncertain, no longer seemed daunting. Maggie had found her new family, one that accepted her, supported her, and loved her unconditionally. And in return, she was ready to embrace them fully, knowing that together they could face whatever came next. As the last of the leaves turned golden and the crisp air settled in for the season, Maggie felt a deep sense of peace she had never known before. Her life, though different from what she had envisioned, was more fulfilling than she had ever imagined. The small moments of joy, sipping tea with Joe and Sarah, reading quietly in her cottage, or even helping Eleanor at the bookstore, had begun to fill her days in ways she hadn't anticipated. But it was the quieter, more reflective moments that gave her the greatest sense of growth. Maggie spent many evenings walking alone along the river near her cottage, pondering her journey. The weight of her past, the abandonment by her children, the years of sacrifice, and the quiet ache of loneliness no longer defined her. She had let go of the hurt and embraced the life she had created. In a way, she had come full circle. One chilly afternoon, as Maggie walked into town to pick up some groceries, she noticed a familiar car parked in front of the bookstore. She paused, her heart beating faster as she recognized the license plate. It was her son, Ben. Without thinking, she walked toward the shop, unsure of what to expect. When she opened the door, the bell above it jingled, and Ben looked up from a table in the corner of the bookstore. His face was older, more mature, but his eyes still held the same warmth that Maggie had always loved. "Mom?" he said, his voice filled with surprise. Maggie stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, emotions swirling inside her. She had thought of this moment countless times, never knowing if it would ever come to pass. She had prepared herself for so long for this kind of reunion, but now that it was here, all she could do was breathe deeply and gather her thoughts. "Ben," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't expect to see you here." Ben stood up, his expression unsure but filled with longing. I've been meaning to come see you. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything, for not being there when you needed me." Maggie's heart clenched at his words. It was the apology she had waited for, though she wasn't sure what to do with it now. She had let go of so much of the past, but hearing him acknowledge it stirred up emotions she had tucked away. "You don't have to apologize," Maggie said gently, her voice thick with emotion. "I've made my peace with everything. I've had time to heal, Ben." Ben took a step forward, his eyes searching hers. "But I didn't realize how much you'd been through, how much you'd carried all these years. I took you for granted. And I've been thinking, maybe it's not too late for us. Maybe I could make things right." Maggie felt a lump in her throat, but she steadied herself. "I've learned a lot in these past months. I've learned that healing isn't about waiting for others to make things right. It's about learning to heal on your own, in your own time. But that doesn't mean I don't want to see you. I need time to process all of this." Ben nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I get it. I'll give you the space you need. But I want you to know that I'm here, Mom. And I'll be here, no matter what. I'll try to be the son you deserve." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maggie simply nodded, feeling the years of absence, of heartache, slowly begin to release their grip. This wasn't the immediate reunion she had once hoped for, but it was a start. It was a beginning, not an end. Over the next few weeks, Ben continued to reach out. He would send short, thoughtful messages, checking in, asking if she was doing well. Maggie appreciated the effort, but she also knew that healing was a slow process. Her relationship with Ben wasn't going to be fixed overnight. She had spent years raising him, and the years of silence and distance had created a chasm that couldn't simply be bridged with a few kind words. But with each step, Maggie felt more open to the possibility of reconnection. She spent time reflecting on what she truly wanted from this relationship, not just the mother-son dynamic she had once envisioned, but a partnership of mutual respect and understanding. She didn't need Ben to fix her, to make up for the years of loss. She just needed him to meet her where she was, to move forward together, without the weight of past mistakes hanging over them. One afternoon, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Ben came over to the cottage. He had a small bouquet of flowers in his hand, a gesture so simple yet so meaningful. He knocked lightly on the door, and Maggie opened it to find him standing there, his expression both vulnerable and sincere. "Mom, I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "but I'm trying. I really am." Maggie smiled softly, her heart swelling. She took the flowers from his hand and stepped aside, inviting him in. "Let's sit down and talk," she said, leading him to the small living room where they had once spent so many family holidays together. As they sat side by side, Maggie realized that, despite everything, they were still family. The love was still there, buried under years of silence and hurt, but it was there. And with time, maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt that a new chapter was beginning, one filled with potential, filled with the quiet promise of healing and growth. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she was no longer afraid. Whatever came next, she knew she could face it, because she had learned to embrace both the past and the unknown with an open heart. The next morning, Maggie sat by the window, watching the snow settle on the ground outside. The world seemed quieter now, softer, as if it, too, was taking a deep breath before the next step. Maggie had learned that life wasn't about avoiding the storms. It was about learning to dance in the rain. And in that moment, as she looked at the path ahead, Maggie knew she was ready for whatever came next. The future was full of possibilities, and she was no longer walking it alone. She had her new family, her new life, and most importantly, she had learned to love herself again. The circle was complete.